Hola amigos, ahora es cerca de el 10 de la mañana y uh, es el tiempo por .NET API review.
Para,
And damn it,
but
I
yeah.
mean, darn. um, uh, uh, and yeah, so nobody really asked for a continuation of German, but one person asked for Spanish. So there we go. I tried Spanish and it went poorly, just like
No,
German
no,
did the first time.
it was close enough. Close enough.
Is 10
I
masculine?
understood. 10, yes.
LDAs?
You
LDAs?
don't say you don't use el or la. Just son las. Ah, no, actually it's feminine, so it's las 10 de la mañana.
Alrighty. Okay, well, in a language that I understand, like C sharp, let's get started. So, uh, we have a very full list, and some of them are red. So, without further delay, augment regex extensibility point for better perf and span based matching 59629er, and yes, his name is Reginald X. Regex. Steve.
Yeah. So this first red is my.
I
Well, I
think
don't know actually.
Jose is going to do it.
Okay.
No,
Yeah,
Jose, go
yeah.
for it.
Okay. So basically, it's been a long asked feature to just spanify and have like zero allocation APIs in regex. We haven't done it. The reason why is basically because of the way that internals of regex work, the way that it was designed 20 years ago. It isn't very friendly to introduce regex-based APIs. But we were ready to prototype this time around and finally just go in and yeah, prototype all of these refactorings in order to be able to support span-based APIs. And so we're ready. We have the first prototype and it's working. It's actually in PR right now. And the first APIs that we want to propose, a lot of this, I mean, you can, if you want, go in and read. If you just want to scroll down directly to the APIs that we're proposing, the first ones that we want to propose are actually none of those are actually still, yeah, there you go, ismatch. So we basically just want to add ismatch overloads that taking span instead of string. Same thing that we did. I think we discussed this about like 2 or 3 weeks ago, where should we or should we not include static overloads. Last time we said yes, let's do static overloads because it just resonates with the rest of the API. It follows precedence. So that's why we have all of these static overloads as well. And so this is the primary 4 APIs that we want to propose today. And then because of all of that refactoring that I was talking about earlier, and all of those changes that have to go in the inner engine in order to support this, particularly for the source generator, then that's why we are proposing also the APIs on top. Those are mainly just things that we need in order to be able to expose span-based APIs. So that's a bunch of abstract methods, turn them to virtual because we're not going to use them anymore. And then above, there's just one virtual scan method that we are proposing inside regex runner. We don't expect anybody to call this scan-based method, just as we have seen that nobody is actually calling directly the abstract methods that we're turning into virtual. Those are just inner things that we are using basically in our compile engine and in our source generated engine. We expect that to stay the same. So these are changes that the end user will not realize. The main APIs that we want to propose is ismatch, and this is kind of like the first proposal with span-based APIs, apart from count, that we actually also propose to use span APIs. But then we do plan to expose a little bit more APIs that are also spanified. So we were thinking about enumerate as well, but we don't have to talk about that today. So today is just mainly about the 4 ismatch overloads. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't
So,
know if Steve wants to add anything, but
I mean, I can add a little color commentary. Can you hear me?
yep.
Yeah. So these virtual methods, or these abstract methods that are there, as Jose mentioned, they're entirely in support of what in .NET Framework, there's this regex.compile to assembly method which spits out a DLL containing the code for a particular regex implementation. And so for it to plug in and be used by the regex type is essentially as a driver calling into that compiled implementation, these effectively two abstract methods. There's a third, but it's basically a no-op. Find, first, char, and go were used. But they're, you can see they don't take any arguments. And that's because all the state is passed in basically as protected fields on the regex runner type. And one of those fields is the string that was being passed in to the string that you're searching. So in a span world, you could imagine us just adding a protected span field to that regex runner, but we can't do that because you can't have a span field on a class. So we basically need another way to pass the span in, and that's why we're adding this scan virtual method that takes the span argument, because that's really the only way we can get it in there. And as long as we need to expose something new to take a span, we want to expose the surface area that we actually think we can implement most efficiently. And that's a single scan method rather than multiple find, first, char, and go methods. Yep.
So, having never seen the regex runner class as a public thing, I looked, and there's a current scan, but it's I guess they're both internal, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Well, no,
they're protected.
They're protected internal. So so from an outside person's perspective, they're protected.
Okay.
To my knowledge, literally no one has ever called this method ever in the history of .NET. I mean, I could be wrong, but there's no reason to do it, and I don't know why someone would. It's not virtual, so no one's going to override it. I honestly don't know what its purpose is. Maybe it was a mistake of history. I don't know.
Do compiled regex override this?
No, it's not virtual.
Oh,
They
right, 'cause it's
override-
not virtual, yeah.
Yeah. So this thing, scan, this is the method that actually today calls find, first, char, and go, which are the main drivers that actually know how to match a input to a pattern. So what compile to assembly method today, solution today does is it overrides find, first, char, and go. So what we're proposing in here is instead of having to override find, first, char, and go, which doesn't really apply to all cases, is instead just have a scan method. So the thing that actually calls those two, and then that's the thing that you pass in the span into, and that's the thing that actually operates and makes the pattern matching on an input.
I think, Jeremy, maybe the point you might have been, Jeremy, the point you might have been getting at is, well, there's already these scan methods. Is this really like an overload of those? I logically think of it as one, but literally no one else is going to call this method besides us. So if we want to pick a different name, I'm fine with that as well.
No, it's like, yeah, I'm just looking at it, and they have a completely different set of inputs. Like, you can certainly say that, I don't know why you have text beginning and text start, but whatever. That this is the span that you now want to pass in, but the
Text
current
beginning and text end, yes.
the current regex, like the current scan takes a regex, and so
this scan method, the very first thing this scan method does, the existing one, is take all of those inputs and write them to fields on the regex runner, and then find, first, char, and go are able to read the state from those fields. So all the state is then available to find, first, char, go, and the new scan method. The only thing we can't pass as those fields is the span, and that's the only argument to the proposed method.
Right. So this refactoring that I was talking about, what we're doing is all of that initialization that happens today as part of the beginning of scan, we move that out. Now that's happening before.
Right. So those are all writable fields, so you can just assign them and call it yourself. And that's the part that my brain wasn't latching onto. It's like, but you lost data.
Not really.
We had a debate amongst ourselves about whether we should just, instead of having the scan method read those fields, whether we should instead pass all the state in as arguments, and that's valid as well. Problem with that is we already know there are potentially other things we're going to want to expose publicly in the future. For example, there's this other field that's currently internal called quick, which basically tells whether you're performing in these match. And that's interesting for an engine because it captures and it can it can reuse a singleton match object and things like that. We don't currently need to expose that because the source generator today doesn't need it. But if we were to add source generator support for the non-backtracking implementation, it actually would need that information. So we'd need to either expose another field or yet another overload of scan if all the arguments were being passed in. So more fields in the future, it's more versionable.
Fair enough.
If you're interested in knowing, like, and that's outside of this API proposal, but I did paste in the chat, like basically a gist of how regex works in its internals and how it calls regex runner and all that, in case anybody is interested.
There's one interesting, almost anecdote here, but sorry, I'm walking my dog and I'm about to go through a dead zone, I think. So if you can't hear me, let me know. The refactoring that we're doing basically will let even existing regex.compile to assembly assemblies continue to work. However, if that's only the case if you use the existing string-based method. You use an existing compile to assembly method that you built from .NET Framework, and you pass in a span, we have to decide what we want to do there. We have two options, basically. We can either manufacture a string from that span, which is pretty expensive or potentially very expensive, or we can throw an exception. Both of them are perfectly feasible. We just need to decide what's the, how much we care, since that is not a super common thing to do. And then like
We stopped hearing you.
Which presumably he can't hear.
I stopped talking.
Oh.
Oh.
Sorry.
It seemed abrupt. But okay, so the presumably current flows that aren't using this, they're going to still get an implementation of regex runner that has these as non-throwing.
Correct.
Because the fact that these were abstract means something somewhere was creating a derived type, and that's what people were getting.
Yeah, compile to assembly creates that derived, like the .NET Framework compiled to assembly method creates those derived types today. Source generator does it tomorrow, and all that code all continues to work as long as you are using existing APIs to access it, the existing string-based APIs.
Okay, I guess I'll do a sanity check to feel like I'm adding value. Regex, that is match. Yep, pattern second. Okay. All right, any objections? Concerns?
Do people have an opinion on the issue that I called out? I mean, I realize it's corner case, but someone used .NET Framework, they built the wrap with regex.compile to assembly, so they have a DLL that contains the regex implementation. They now bring that DLL to .NET Core, and it works. And now they start calling the new span-based APIs. Any opinion for whether that should throw or start allocating like crazy?
Would there ever be the option to, the first time it's called, kind of make something that is cacheable and that works with span?
We could. I mean, imagine we had the long requested feature for dictionary that allows you to have a dictionary of, string, but look up with a span. We could, or a hash set for the same thing. We could then maintain some sort of dictionary of strings we've seen in the past, indexed by the span, and basically, have an interning table that we ourselves manage and some sort of eviction policy. Be complicated and, caches are hard, but in theory we could do it.
Yeah, I think my vote would be, just allow it to work by calling toString on the span, because that's what the original calling code would have done anyway in order to get it to work. So it's not any worse than the full framework application would have done in terms of performance.
I mean, I'd make the caller do that, and I would make it throw. We can fix throwing. We can't fix other things.
It would be worse if someone switched to using the ismatch span overload. They would all of a sudden, it would be worse than .NET Framework, because all of a sudden we would start every match would allocate the full length of the input.
Yeah.
But that's what you would have had to do anyway
No,
in
that's
a full
what
framework application in order to call this.
They would have had to do. So they see it.
Yes.
So let them see it, and then maybe refactor their code so that they don't take a span.
It's not like it just suddenly breaks, right? Like they have to opt in to calling the new span APIs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct.
You can, I guess the thing that I'm paranoid about is you have two components being pulled into your application, neither of which you own. One of them is the compiled regex, and the other one is a caller that calls a span-based API.
But they would have needed... Like, this would only matter on... Oh, I guess this is the instance regex is match on a regex that was compiled.
Correct.
Yeah.
But what are the odds some other component got a hold of a regex from a different component?
Yeah, you would have needed to have, returned the regex to someone who then changed to be calling... It seems super limited. I'd make it throw
data
until
annotations.
Until we have better plans.
Yeah. So one example could be data annotations, for instance. You have a library that has a bunch of custom compiled data annotations attributes. You put it on top of your object model, and then, ASP.NET is calling the span-based overload because that's what they do for efficiency. You, the application developer, don't control either of those components. It's not your code.
Yeah, but the workaround is fairly easy. I'm pretty sure even a compiled regex gives you back the original pattern. So you would just, if you hit it in this compat case that you're the weird one, or you accepted a regex and you're calling the span overload, you either catch and then do the toString yourself, or you catch and replace it with a non-compiled version of the same regex.
Well, in the scenario that I gave, the workaround would be that the app developer actually changes their object model. Because remember, they're not the ones actually calling regex.isMatch.
No. It would be whoever calls regex.isMatch would have the bug.
That would be ASP.NET.
Okay.
In the example that I just gave.
I have absolutely no problem believing that ASP.NET would have the bug.
I think you're going to get significant pushback if ASP.NET starts spanifying their APIs, and then we tell them, hey, by the way, you have to pessimistically call toString on this, just in case somebody gave you a regex that was from full framework.
But we have regex.is compiled.
And the thing you're using this .NET framework stuff that we don't support anymore in core, right? The compile to assembly. And you're probably doing that for perf reasons. And so to just make this allocate like crazy probably defeats the whole reason you're doing it in the first place. So you should find out about it up front, I think.
Yeah. Again, my personal opinion is throw until proven otherwise, because that's the position we can change. We can't change the other.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right. Samplers should be allowed to modify trace state. Number 63652. Tarek.
Yes. Yeah, this will be fun. Okay, before I start, I have a proposal here, and I have also alternative proposals, because I'm expecting to get some good discussion about the original proposal. Anyway, to give a quick background here, in tracing, while you are creating any activity using activity source, we support something called sampling mechanism, and sampling is is the way that the listeners can decide about like if they are interested to have this activity get created or just sample it out and ignore it. The way that it works, it works through the activity listener, and the activity listener will have a callback, and this callback, it will receive the event of the creation of this activity. And inside this callback, I mean, we pass what we call it activity creation option. This is a struct, and we pass it by reference to this callback. And this struct will be just wrapping all creation parameters that the activity is requested to create it with. And the sampler can decide about like, you know, if need to sample in or sample out this activity. So far, so good. I mean, like, we have created this struct as a read-only struct because originally the sampler was like just like, you know, getting the parameters of the activity creations and decide about like, you know, reading this parameter and decide to sample in or sample out. But now in the OpenTelemetry specs, they allow to change something inside for this activity creation to allow changing what we call it trace state. So trace state is just like a state that it's part of the trace context in general. So right now, I mean, like this proposal is just allowing to change the trace state during the sampling mechanism. If you see the proposal if you see the usage in the proposal, it's just like this is the callback, which is receiving the struct activity creation option struct and can do whatever it wants there. The question now about like, because like this is a read-only struct, so we cannot allow mutating anything inside the activity creation options. And my proposal here is we will convert this struct to be not read-only struct. We had some offline discussions, I mean, like about like if this is treated as breaking change or not. And my understanding is as long as we are not going to change the state of the current existing properties or fields inside the struct to stay like read only, so this shouldn't be like a breaking change if we guarantee that. So my proposal here is, this is the original, I mean the proposal is change the activity creation options to be not read only struct and add this trace state property to it to be mutable property that you can read and write to it to support this, I mean the trace state mutation during the sampling. As I mentioned about like I have another alternative proposals, but I prefer the proposal that I'm voting here because like this is the simplest and straightforward one that users, I mean, can just like feel it's natural. I mean, like we are not doing something like indirect or something like this. Anyone, I mean, like, do you want to see the alternatives or just like, let's discuss this first and see how it goes?
I mean, certainly what you've written here is a breaking change. Because at minimum, the read-only needs to move to every existing member. So as written, this is a breaking change.
So if moving read-only to every existing member, why this will be breaking change?
Well, but that's not what you wrote down. Your diff here does not include modifying or adding the read-only state to every existing member. So I'm doing that offline. I'm just pointing out what you wrote is actually a breaking change. You said stop being read-only. That's it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. I assume that I.
Yeah. Just remember to update. Just update the rough API, and you should be good.
Yeah. I mean that's what I'm doing right now. So personally, given that this is already a ref, which means you can write back through it, I would just go with a wither. I can't believe I said that. And have it make a copy that has the trace state specified and then just write back through the ref.
Yeah, this is one of the alternative proposals. Yeah, and I think I picked up this from you also. But my point here is like, in the future, I mean, like if we need to do something more with that, I mean, it feels unnatural. I got like to just to make a copy of the struct and rewrite it back. I mean, to the ref, just to write a field inside the struct. I mean this
that's
doesn't feel
how records work.
I mean, in theory, you could imagine that the runtime would be smart enough to elide writes that have no effect. But are we talking from a runtime optimization perspective, or from the code that you write perspective?
Yeah, for the code usability, I mean, like the patterns that you write the code. I'm not that much concerned about the perf of like copying the struct and writing back, but I'm just concerned about the patterns that users, you will see it like it's weird. If you go down, I mean, I can show you the example.
Right. Well, so the problem with any mutable struct, and so for what it's worth, our guidelines are do not have a mutable struct. That's where they start, and then you get to argue off of that position. Is if you ever save one of these in a read-only field, you can call the trace state setter, but that will make a copy, call the setter on the copy, and then throw the copy away. So if
don't we have warnings on that now, though?
Mutable structs are a problem in the C# language. Like,
I swear we had warnings for that nowadays, though, like that would keep people from doing that.
Maybe
we have warnings explicitly for spin lock, I think. I don't think we have a general case analyzer.
I see.
I might be mistaken on that, though.
If we had such a thing, would that kind of ease the concern about this pattern?
I mean, like, my starting position is we have 20 years, because as someone pointed out in the chat, our birthday was yesterday. We have 20 years of .NET history saying don't have mutable structs. So that's always our starting position, is don't have a mutable struct. Since this was designed as a struct, I think we should follow our own guidance, and we have patterns for how to deal with that, and that's, basically a copy and modify constructor, aka a wither, using what the records call them. And this is already a writable context, so it fits naturally into the space.
But how is this different from the net result at the end? I mean, like, you are actually modifying the struct, right? I mean, at the end.
Because you see you're making a copy.
Yeah.
Like, if you said, underscore activity options dot with trace state whatever, like, that returns a new activity options that you didn't assign anywhere. You see that it made a copy that you ignored. If you say underscore activity options equal underscore activity options dot with trace state, then that'll fail of this is a read-only field, you can't assign anymore. Assuming it was read-only.
I still feel like that pit of failure can be detected and contained, though. I mean, I don't disagree with you that it should be a wither, but I guess I'm just having heartache with the reasoning for it, even though the conclusion I agree with.
I also think that there's a bit of a difference between an options type and something which is basically only passed in as an input to things. That's the expected use, in something like spin lock, where the expected use case is it's a field of a class where someone's likely going to mark it read only. There's a little bit of a difference there, but there's still the potential for the pit of failure. I also think that because it's a options type, there's not really a huge need for it to be mutable. There's like 5 or 6 different initialization options, and you can make it get init, which allows you to have it be immutable, but still have the nice initialization syntax options that C# provides.
Is this
So-
necessary to be a struct? Sorry.
I think it already shipped.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
And even if it hadn't already shipped, I think we had discussed most of the options types. It's desirable that for them to be a value type, because they're basically, you create it, you pass it in, and then everything in it you want to have copied. You don't want to have a shared reference that multiple things could happen to be using at the same time, et cetera, and so you don't want to end up with like, oh, I've got to create 2 allocations just to initialize this other allocation.
I don't think this follows that kind of options pattern. Like the constructor's internal, like users don't allocate this or don't create it. This is something we pass out to user code.
That's right. And we pass it once at a time, I mean, so we don't have like multiple will be passed the same struct in the same time.
Would this be passed to multiple listeners?
Yeah,
Like I see it
one after the other.
right. So which trace state wins?
The last.
Well, it's
If all of them are changing, so the last will win. This is happening with in general.
I guess that like the fact that it's read only now is very clear. Like everyone is looking at the exact same state, and so they're all equal.
But the thing you got in your callback was a ref to it, so you could have written a new one back over it.
Yeah, there is also about like there is a field inside this struct is called tags. I don't remember, it's tag collection or something like this, which is you can add more tags or remove tags from it. So it's not, this is by design for OpenTelemetry. I mean, like this is expected, like.
Things got awfully quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, like, so again, we can certainly do it. You know, Jared couldn't come up with anything that read-only on the type versus read-only on every member makes a distinction of, aside from reflection. And so we believe we can remove read-only off the type decal in a safe way. So we have the capability of doing this, but our starting point says
But
you
hold
picked
on.
a struct, so it should be read-only.
But wait a minute. It's a non-breaking to remove read-only from the type and put it on all the members. Where it becomes breaking is when you start adding mutable members, which this does.
Why?
Because you're changing something, so you start having copies being made. Right?
So that's not the breaking thing. Exposing a mutable member on a struct isn't breaking and won't introduce a copy. It's only if you try. It's only if you go and try and invoke a mutable method. So calling the getter would not copy. Calling the setter would copy.
Calling the getter would copy unless it's an autoprop and knows that it should have automatically called it read-only.
Or you explicitly mark it read-only.
Right.
Right, this getter would have to be marked read-only explicitly. And calling the setter will make a copy of the struct if it was passed by in or something like that.
Yeah, or any of the times that the compiler felt like it should make a copy, yeah.
Right.
Which, if it was easy, we would have analyzers detecting that state, but it's not easy, so we don't.
And there's no scenario where you can end up losing state as part of that?
Well, go ahead, Tom.
I was gonna say, if you have a copy and another, if you make a copy, you now have two copies. So if two things try and mutate the thing, then you're going to end up with bifurcated state. You're not going to be sharing it, and that's the whole issue with like spin lock, with it being mutable. But if all you're doing is making a copy and you want it to be a copy, a new thing, then there's no issue.
The argument being that this member is brand new, and therefore no one could be relying on it being the same as it was before.
Right. Notably, if we wanted this to be a reference type, we could just, we can take the struct and change the internal member to be an allocation, and then it's the same thing. Right. It's just a wrapper. So that's always an option in the future as well.
It would be a break, though, if we made just to make sure we're on the same page, if we made the type not read-only and did not add read-only to one of the existing members.
Yeah, that would be a behavioral break, because
right.
then it would be a behavioral break in that case, because then existing code would not copy, but new code would copy. And if we ever mutated it in the future, if we ever changed the implementation to actually mutate in the future, then the old code that's not recompiled will not be copying when it should have, and so it will observe the mutation.
So the saving grace here is this is a net new property.
Right. Yeah. From the performance question of does it make copies unnecessarily from reading things that actually had no side effects. As long as every existing thing is marked read-only when the read-only is moved off the type, Jared says that would be fine. And then nobody could have seen that the type was marked read-only and seen the new property at the same time, so they wouldn't fall into a...
Right.
They wouldn't get a read-only escape from that pattern. But right. Any member that was previously read-only ever changing to be not read-only, and then to fully describe when the break happens, and then take advantage of the fact that they're allowed to modify the contents of the struct. That's when you start getting the weird, you can see side effects happening in a read-only field, and as soon as you recompile, they go away, and then you don't understand how you got into that state in the first place.
Yes. So the question now about, as I mentioned about, like, if we keep whatever we have today is read-only, we will keep it read-only. So what would be the risk we are taking here if we change it, the structure from read-only to non-read-only?
I mean, it's weird, and it's against guidelines.
Okay. Should we look at the alternative proposals and see if it's whatever, I mean, matches the guidelines at least? Yeah, the first one, it's kind of like, it looks strange a little bit for me, but this is another way about like to add set trace state. I mean, this is to set the trace state on this struct. And the weird thing with that about, like, if you have like read-only struct and you have a method that's called set trace state, it looks like unlogical to me, but this is one way. The alternative proposal too, this is what Jeremy mentioned, I mean, in the beginning, about like copying the struct and resetting it. So
if you just make it get init, then the C# with the actual wither pattern will work, and you don't need a method for it. You can just do value with trace state equals new value, and C# will take care of creating a copy of the struct with all the members and replacing the trace state. You just need to have it be init instead of set.
Can you write it? I mean, in the chat at least, I mean, so I can.
Yeah, give me a second.
The question there becomes whether do you want to allow this to be set only at construction time or with a widder. That's basically what init does instead of set.
I just checked in SharpLab, and the with expression only works with records. It doesn't just work with any init setter.
It works with. It's supposed to work with any kind of property in field.
Well, it doesn't. I'll send the SharpLab link in the chat.
Yeah, it's with C#10. It can be a structure type or anonymous type. It's C#9 that's only a record.
Okay.
Okay, so C# next fixes it.
No. C#10 is already shipped.
Oh, okay.
We're on
Just
C#11.
that particular branch of default on SharpLab doesn't support it. But
right.
Yeah, if you change your branch to main, it's fine.
Yeah, I changed it to main and it works. I did not know that. Good to know.
Yep, and Godbolt also supports C# now, not just C++ and stuff. So you can also check out a lot of this stuff in there.
Fair enough. So I think that this is now, according to C#10, the idiomatic way to do this.
Yep, and since
again, if you, so I was gonna say again, if you don't want it to be able to set on an arbitrary instance, you only want to do it as part of a construction or a copy, which might be fine.
Right, and with the current usage, the only time that anybody wants to modify this is they have a writable ref, so they can just say activity options equal activity options with trace state, whatever.
Right.
I thought there was mention of a tag. Did I miss that?
So there's activity
Creation options.
So an existing property is a I thought it was a dictionary. It's just an enumerable.
That doesn't look settable to me. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, we have another.
Oh, sampling tags?
Yeah, sampling tags.
Yeah, there we go. So
yeah.
That's a collection. The collection has an add member, so you can't replace the sampling tags, but you can, alter the concept of what tags are being sampled,
right.
or whatever that means.
Unrelated. What is that exclamation point?
I think that's emo-ease for not null.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Inventing C# syntax, are we, Emo?
He added this while a bunch of the nullability stuff was in the air, and I think just hasn't gone back and revisited it.
Yeah, there are just some weird little nits with it, like the fact that it shows protected internal, for instance.
Well, it should show protected internal because that's the fam and a sim instead of sorry, that's fam or a sim, not fam and a sim. Fam and a sim's the good one, but we only added it recently, which was private protected.
Yeah. No one cares about the internal aside from us. But yeah.
Out of curiosity, is there a way to make like a well-known sampling tag that could solve this problem? There's already a way to make this mutable. Can't that just be shoved into the sampling tags in some way instead of creating a new property, like having a well-known? like trace state, something some horrible name.
We are trying to not to have like semantic conventions for stuff like this. This is one reason, and second reason is if you are requesting the sampling tag, we are going to allocate at the time the collection. So we are trying to avoid any allocation in this code. So if somebody interested in trace state only, I mean, they shouldn't see any allocation.
All right. Does anyone feel we should do anything other than that?
Just to confirm, the new feature in C# 10 is just a language syntactical sugar that can work with the older version of the runtime, right?
Right.
Yes.
And by the way, is there a way to tell if a particular feature in C# 10 require a certain version of runtime, or it will work with the older version?
It will fail to compile on the older runtime. Like C# will not let you use something like DIMS if you're targeting full framework. It will actually fail to compile, and you won't be able to produce your binary. So you shouldn't have to worry about something like accidentally compiling for net standard and blowing up somewhere else.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Okay, this looks good to me.
Any other feedback? Sold.
Thank you.
La foi.
We
I
went
know
with
all the languages poorly.
We went with init. Is that what we did?
Yeah.
Is that our first init in the entire framework?
Maybe.
Congratulations, Tarek.
Yeah. Everyone take note. I am not opposed to new features as long as they're not too new. Okay.
Now my name will be in the history.
All right. Library import attribute for pinvoke source generation 46822. Aaron. Or Jeremy. Or anyone, really. I don't care. Equal opportunity.
Is this we talked about this one previously? Is this revisiting parts of it, like the string marshalling stuff?
Yeah. So this was updated. I actually have to go, so I'm going to turn this over to Eleanor or Jeremy. But this is just a clarification on some feedback that we had before.
Yeah, so this is the source generation attribute that we talked about before, and the main concern was the user experience around having a nice way to specify the string marshalling. So what we added is that string marshalling property and the string marshalling enumeration. And there's also a usage example of it, which should hopefully address the concerns around UX and IntelliSense.
So what if you need, uh, just to ask, I notice it says machine Indian format. What if you need explicitly little or big Indian instead?
So
And then likewise, what about the other types of string marshalling that the built-in marshaller currently supports, like Beaster and the other com strings?
We
So
kept
Beaster
the-
was never on char set. Beaster was always you have to specify on every individual member. So we're fine with not having that on the string marshalling enum. And also the source generator currently doesn't support Beasters because that's more of a COM concept. So that would come with the COM source generator work that's planned for later in this release.
Yeah, the enum was really for what we think will be the most common, like what we want to promote as first class. And if you want to use other things, we have the custom marshalling or like string marshal strings using less nice looking version.
I mean, I imagine without exaggerating, UTF-8 and UTF-16 are probably the 99.9% use case, right?
Do we not need ASCII/ASCII 8? Like, if you're calling a Windows something 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 A function, then if it gives you a
You're doing
value greater
ANSI
than
rather than ASCII.
Fancy?
okay, I mean whatever it stands, but it's if you get a value greater than 127, UTF-8 is going to interpret it one way, and encoding.ASCII will interpret it another.
Yeah, so
You
we
can't set Windows to use a UTF-8 code page nowadays. So the A variants would accept UTF-8 in that scenario.
we also didn't want to keep promoting ANSI. So our idea is that we won't include it in that nice string marshalling version, but we can do something like provide a custom marshaller that people can use in that marshal strings using less nice syntax that they'll have to specify the type and it'll be our ANSI marshaller.
I'm not sure that we should be saying we don't recommend it. In the Unix world, many APIs explicitly don't support UTF-8, and they're only ANSI, ASCII, whatever you want to call it. UTF-8 is sometimes supported and it's sometimes opt-in, but there's 40 to 50 years of existing APIs that don't support UTF-8 and might not support UTF-8. It's just there's also a huge optimization you can get perf-wise by knowing I'm converting to UTF-8 or to just ASCII rather than UTF-8.
So right now, ANSI, the charset ANSI option is UTF-8 on non-Windows. We do not have a built-in ASCII charset for non-Windows. So we already don't have good support for that scenario.
But
so we could add an ASCII member there, but it would be different than ANSI. It would not replicate the charset ANSI behavior. So it would not be code page dependent on Windows, and it would not be UTF-8 on Unix. We'd be using specifically the ASCII encoding, which is different from ANSI, because ANSI respects code pages on Windows and is UTF-8 on all non-Windows platforms today.
Okay, I'm specifically talking about ASCII, which is the standard hex 30 is 0, and capital A through Z, lowercase a through Z. Okay. Non-code page specific support, and which should ideally just be using the existing system text encoding support to do the conversion.
I mean, we to Jeremy's point, we already don't support that on Unix today. So you're asking for a net new feature over not just the source generator, but all of our existing support. We could augment the enum in the future if it became an issue and add the whole feature for it, but I don't think that needs to be an issue discussed in this API review because that's actually proposing a brand new feature.
Yeah, and for supporting that, we'd probably start with a custom marshaller that you could assign to marshal strings using, and then add an option to the enum on string marshalling that would map to that marshaller.
Yeah. So I know I always work in things that nobody else works in. There are Windows crypto APIs that, because they needed the bytes to be consistent across versions, that they have A versions that they never added W versions for. So those are you need to call them with, I guess, ANSI. And but I mean, if they're super minority, then maybe the specifying the type of a converter is good enough. It's just I don't know how many people or how many other places need to call Windows A routines instead of W routines on a 64-bit
Jeremy,
system.
there.
Yeah. So
Jeremy,
one
as far
thing
as
that we might be able to do for
know,
that.
there's very little. So,
Okay.
my exposure with the Win32 APIs is, which is kind of broad, but there are a few outside of the stuff you already talked about, but very, very few. It's probably like maybe 1% of the total surface area that has something like that, and they're pretty obscure generally.
Yeah. One thing we could do, because it's unlikely there will be new APIs that only have A variants and don't have W variants. Those are probably already all out there. And at least within the runtime repo, we're already using all of the ones we would be using. The code fix would insert the Marshall strings using member pointing to an ANSI marshaller. And then that would help the transition scenario. Writing new stuff, we'd have it documented, but yes, it wouldn't be as easy to find in string marshalling because it's not the 99% use case.
I think the 99% use case for UTF-8 is being misstated there. Most Unix and POSIX system APIs are not UTF-8.
Well, right now we currently pass UTF-8 to all of them, so
right, which is
looked at this beforehand.
It's probably working because many users aren't actually using UTF-8 there. But like if you're looking at Xlib, Wayland, if you're looking at most of the core POSIX system APIs, many of them are explicitly ASCII, and you actually have to query for UTF-8 support before ever assuming that UTF-8 support exists. It's a feature on top of the default that you have to check for.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even weirder because it's things like libc will use the LC environment variables to know what to use, but other libraries may or may not be using those. So
I'm also not convinced that supporting ASCII from the get-go is a net new feature. We're not talking about something where we have to go and retrofit the built-in Marshall or anything. It would be like SPAN, where it's only supported on the source generator.
I'm still considering SPAN as a net new feature for the source generator. The concept of net new feature is something that's new for the source generator that doesn't have an existing counterpart in the built-in system, is I think what Stephen was referring to.
Okay. But even then, I think it's a trivial feature because you should, like, whether you're choosing ASCII, UTF-8, UTF-16, or UTF-32, the code path to support it in the source generator should ideally just be picking between, am I calling encoding.utf8 or encoding.utf16 or encoding.ascii to do the conversion. There shouldn't be some, magical differences really between them. We should just be calling the built-in efficient span and vectorified implementations. So it should really just be which one we emit the call to.
But this isn't an implementation question. This is we're exposing new API that has been proposed to map to some existing features that we have. You're proposing adding new features, which is a fine thing to propose. But if we're going to do that, it needs to be the full proposal. Like we call, I don't know how many Invokes we have in .NET Runtime, 1,000, half of them for Unix. I'm totally making up numbers. What percentage of them would be switched to use this marshalling.ascii if we had it? I don't know the answer to that, but we should figure that out before we start proposing new features for it.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like right now we have just Unicode and ANSI and then auto and none, whatever those mean.
But ANSI on Unix is UTF-8. That's how it's implemented.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So with the word none here, so I guess I have a couple questions. Let's start. One, does none mean none or does none mean default? And for two, are these bomb sniffing if it's an in and bomb writing if they're an out, or bomb free, or So UTF is stupid because there's like, UTF 16. There's what, 8 variants. So I guess 2 times 2 is 4. So with and without the bomb and little or big Indian.
So for none, the idea is if you set so if you don't specify anything, we wanted a default 0 value. That wasn't one of the options. There is no default string marshalling in the new system. You have to specify something. So if you specify none, then basically there's no mechanism. You've basically said I don't have any strings. I can't marshal strings unless I override it on each parameter.
Okay, so none means there is literally no implicit marshalling, and if you hit a thing that would have required marshalling, then the generator is going to fail or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So none means none. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, there's been too much implicit behavior in the built-in system on like how do you marshal a string or a char that we decided in the new system that we're going to make you be very explicit so you can see everything in source that explains what's going on.
Right. So if you instantiate the property, if this says none, then either this has a value or there were no strings. So string marshalling says none, so marshal strings using would have a non-null value, or the thing you're calling into should have no marshalling.
Or they specified it
At the
specifically
parameter
for
level.
Each parameter, yeah.
Fair enough, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll get to the review for that specific stuff somewhat as the next issue.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess really the answer is whatever UTF-16 says here is what charset.unicode was already doing?
Yeah, so
Yes.
I don't know off the top of my head the answer to your questions about specifics, but it is whatever we did for marshalling right now.
Right, but so it's...
I believe Unicode did not have the byte order mark. I'm not sure about ANSI on non-Windows, aka the new UTF-8. I will have to check that.
Okay, but so UTF-16 here was just 100% identical to charset.unicode. And then UTF-8 is the same as ANSI if you're not on Windows.
Yeah, it's the same as if you use like unmanaged type LP UTF-8 stir.
Okay.
Yeah, so we just call encoding UTF-8 GID bytes, I believe.
Which is the same as what the built-in does for UTF.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is no bomb. And if they put string marshalling UTF-8, then I guess you'll call get string. Or sorry, if they put that on the decal and it says it returns a string, then you will. That would go through get string, which I think is. I don't remember if it's bomb sniffing or bomb rejecting.
We're going to use the encoding.utf
Sure.
object.
Yep.
Whatever that does is what we're going to do.
Right. But either way, both of these, if you're not on Windows, map to an existing set of behavior. This maps to a set of behavior on Windows, and this one is different if you're Windows.
It still maps to like at the parameter level behavior, but not to a char set.
Yeah, there was an LP UTF-8 stir unmanaged type that was added in, I want to say, Netcore 2.1. So we'll match that behavior, which is the same as charset ANSI on non-Windows. So it's all existing behaviors, as Eleanor said.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, yeah. Given that the existing thing only had 2.5 values, this having only 2 values seems reasonable to me. And for things like, Tanner's suggestion that we add straight ASCII, that makes it easy to add in the future. Or the future may be the same release, just, a different proposal. So, I'm happy. Anyone else?
So one quick question about like on Windows, we are not going ever to match the system code page, right?
Yes, we will not be providing a string marshalling enum value that will match the system code page. There can be some, we can write a custom marshaller that we would assign to marshal strings using. It's not, it doesn't, basically we're not providing the extra nice experience for it because it's a very niche case for where it's still required. But there will still be a mechanism to do so.
Right, because that's not a 3264. That's a Windows before and after 1995. Okay.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, don't 32-bit still call A's, but no, you call the A is only the default if you're built without Unicode, which no flavor of Windows is built without Unicode anymore. Okay. And yeah, string marshalling. I assume we don't have a conflicting type anywhere else.
I do not believe so. But there's still the argument
I don't
about
think so.
Yeah. It's still the whole thing that we're going through right now with the Cloudern AI style guide. Still waiting on a response from them about 1L versus 2Ls, but they have not responded. So.
They did. It was that they don't understand why we were reading their style guide at all.
Yeah, no, then there was a second... Oh, wait, Jeremy, you're not included on that email.
Okay.
There was a second email that got sent out after that response to the Cloudern AI style guide instead of that style guide. Asking, hey, can we do this for our area? And they just haven't responded yet.
Fair enough. I mean, so, yeah, as mentioned in the issue and then in email that not everybody who's seeing this video got, we definitely have a de facto double L in our API surface area. Whether or not the docs are going to match that, this is the correct spelling for the API surface.
Sounds good to me. I like that. I like the double L.
I like the double L too.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if we talked about the name of the type-based parameter previously. I think it's a little clunky, but I don't have a better name.
Yeah. We could do, instead of marshal strings using, we could do strings marshal using, so it matches the marshal using attribute a little bit closer.
Yeah, so the intent of that was to match the marshal using attribute, which is the next API review.
Along with the other I mentioned there too.
If we change the name there, we probably want to change it here too.
Fair enough. Anybody want to yell out a name or just shrug and say it's interrupt and no one cares?
Marshal string behavior.
That would be very inconsistent with the other one, but if we change the other one, then I'd be fine with that.
I think the main thing about marshal string, like, I understand what it means, but when I see using in C#, the first thing I think of is not this is how it's being done, but rather like using declarations, using statements, etc. I think marshal string behavior doesn't leave it as a like open-ended question, but rather kind of like a here's the selected option that's going to be used. But I'm also not hard set on it, and I could live with marshal string using.
Yeah, the idea with the using is I was looking for some sort of verb that would kind of be similar to marshal as, but also a distinctively different word, because the marshal using attribute that's in the next API, the next item on the API review, is it's the struct marshalling and parameter marshalling rules. And the marshal using attribute is basically the source generated modern replacement for the marshal as attribute. So I wanted a name that kind of had a similar feel to it.
What about implementation? Marshal string implementation?
Yeah, it's weird.
I mean, the type that you specify is instantiated and does the actual thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like if we wanted to look like other things here, we'd have string marshalling is the enum and string marshaller is the type, but then I think people would be like, do I do marshalling or marshaller? It's like, well, which one do you think is easier? Use that one. This one having a weird name kind of suggests people look at the other one first, which is, we believe, the 99% case.
I mean, you could always say string marshaller kind and string marshaller, and in the case that, and then you could have kind default UTF-8, UTF-16, and custom. And if it's custom, you're required to set the type here.
Well, instead of default, it would be none because there is no default. But yes.
Right. None.
Well,
none means custom, or no strings.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm in favor of saying like you want the enum one to be the prefix of the one that returns type. I think because you want the shorter one to be the easy one.
Right, but right now they have
different names, which I also don't like. I would make them like.
So you want string marshalling and string marshaller type?
Something like that.
Or string marshal type?
Yeah.
I think string marshalling type to be parallel to the native marshalling attribute. I want to keep a parallel of the name so that when people see this field, they know that it's corresponding to one of the other two attributes.
Yeah. There's also I want to align the naming so that it's kind of clear that they are related. So they're not independent things, kind of thing. But I kind of agree with Jeremy that this is interop, so maybe we are overthinking it too. But
so,
this one I actually like. Yeah, I think I like that.
Jeremy?
I'm thinking. This brings back some comparisons to the marshal as attribute that I'm not the biggest fan about. Let me see if I can pull up my concerns. In particular, there's the marshal type and the marshal type ref on marshal as that I don't like because one is a string of the type name and one is a type of to the type name. I think this case might be more distinct, so that wouldn't be an issue, but that's my biggest concern.
I think the only thing I don't like about this is string marshalling. Reading it sounds like it's missing something.
What do you mean?
Like, what is a string marshalling? It's not really just a string marshalling. It's a kind or behavior or there's some other postfix that seems like it's missing here.
You mean on the...
Yeah, on the actual keyword and then the enum type that's exposing it. Like it's an option kind behavior, it's a something, it's not just a string marshalling. It reads weird to me.
I think if you look at it in code, when you say like, string marshalling equals UTF-8, I think it becomes somewhat clear what this means. Because basically you're saying do string marshalling like this, right?
Yeah.
Well, why we cannot be explicit saying string marshalling encoding, for example?
I mean, we could. It just means that the second one would get even longer, but yeah.
Yeah. There's also the concern that if we were to ever add support for bster to this enum, bster isn't really an encoding.
I mean, yeah, I was thinking that, and it's like, but you can sort of squint and say it is because an encoding is taking a concept and turning it into bytes.
Right.
Well, that says serialization is an encoding, but yeah.
Are we going to come up with the sandwich rule for encoding?
What is the sandwich rule?
What do you consider a type of sandwich, depending on where there is bread surrounding whatever is on the inside?
Oh, I see.
Oh, yes. And I believe in New Hampshire, a taco is not a sandwich.
Yeah, it's weird stuff like that.
Yeah.
I also don't think that making the string marshalling longer with a postfix means that string marshalling type has to be as well. If you have string marshalling kind and string marshalling type, they still are obviously connected somehow.
I guess, but that hits the. In my brain, those are so close as synonyms that I don't understand why there are two of them.
It's like, what do I use?
Yeah.
Like marshal type ref. Like on marshalized attribute, there's marshal type, there's marshal type ref, there's safe array subtype, and safe array user defined subtype.
Yeah.
And you just look at them and you're like, what do I use here?
Well, even here with string marshalling and string marshalling type, there's going to be some level of question of what's the difference, and someone's going to have to open the docs to see, oh, I use this one and leave type as null if I'm using a built-in one, and I use type if I'm doing a custom behavior. There's always going to be some level of users having to open the docs here, no matter what we name
Sure,
these.
but like you could call it custom marshaller for the one where you're giving the custom string marshaller, and then you know either string marshalling or string marshal type for the other. I think that gives you more of a clue as to what they're about, right? You don't have to look into the docs to see one's the custom string marshaller and the other ones are the easy fast case. That's right, the predefined. Not to make this even more complicated.
From YouTube chat, we have the suggestion of rename none to custom in the enum, and then the property string marshalling custom type.
I like custom because it really
tells you this is not what you want.
Yeah, I'd be fine with that.
Sure.
And then if
yeah. Well, it tells you why you have two of them, right from just looking at the API, without having to look at the box.
Yeah, and then if you specify custom and then you don't specify a custom type for marshalling, then there's no marshalling. So doesn't support it.
Yeah, I like that. I mean,
you could have an analyzer provide a warning or an error or something that says, if you specify custom, you have to specify the custom type. But yeah, Jeremy, while you're doing the notes, it might be worth. There's a comment on the string marshalling that refers to the old name Marshall String's using. You should update that dot comment in the API summary just so we can copy paste things a little bit cleaner. There you go.
You want to make it Stack Overflow friendly, huh?
No, he wants his dot comments to compile.
Easier to use. There's a lot of implicit behavior in the built-in system, so we're trying really hard to get better with it.
Yeah, I mean, this remark is, slightly off. Somebody could be pedantic and say string marshalling, whatever word we decide to put here, custom. But I think that the remark is...
Depends how we implement it. We could just straight up block it if we wanted to.
Indeed. The generator could say, nope, I'm not even going to look. Yeah. Just don't do this. Yeah. So to return to Tanner's point that this feels like an unfinished thought. I think that we probably want to decide that the easy thing should be sooner in IntelliSense. And since now we have to beat a C instead of a T, that means if we want to do anything, it's string marshalling behavior, or we can just leave it as no suffix.
So I don't know. I don't feel as strongly as Tanner does, because I think if we think the type name is correct, I would assert the property name should be fair game too.
I'm not sure he believes that the type name is correct.
Yeah, I feel like string marshalling is just missing a suffix. Like it should be string marshalling kind or behavior, or something to indicate what the enum is representing. But I also don't feel super strongly. It's just like if I were doing this in my own library, my first intuition would be string marshalling kind, and then string marshalling custom type likely. And then rather than none, I'd probably call it default and have a separate entry for custom, just to differentiate between whatever the default behavior is, and which may in fact be none, If it is actually none, then none's a fine name, and I explicitly want to have a custom behavior here. But that's just my own view of it, and my view doesn't always line up with the design guidelines or what everyone else thinks.
I don't think we have design guidelines specifically for what you're describing. Like, I think the only thing we said is like the type should be nouns, right? And I think the same rule applies to properties. So I guess for me, just string marshalling sounds like a noun indicating a process because it has this the ending of ing, and so for me personally, that's sufficient. But yeah, I mean, you do this a lot more, and if you think it's a weird name, then I think I would defer to your judgment on this.
Yeah, I feel that, reading string marshalling .utf16, I'm like, okay, I understand that UTF-16 is a way of marshalling. But if we called it behavior, I wouldn't really behavior UTF-16 doesn't feel like a behavior to me. I mean, we could say it's a kind, but to me, I think that this is correct as is. I could accept other suffixes, but I think I agree with Emo that this is a nounified.
I agree with Jeremy.
I notably don't think it's a big deal, and we've got all kinds of weird names in all places in the library, and the people who are using interop are going to end up getting used to the name no matter what it is. The biggest complaint they're going to have here is probably not it sounds weird, but rather I have to type too much.
Mm-hmm. But that one we have a guideline for. It's seek clarity over short. So,
yeah.
But yeah. So I think this looks good as is.
The only thing I would say, the document on string marshalling custom type should probably say if this field is specified, string marshalling should be set to custom, because you cannot not specify it, right?
Well, that was the generator sees your syntax and it can yell at you that you had both properties assigned in your attribute instantiation. So it's semantic, but also implementation.
Yeah, we'll talk it out in one of the interrupt team meetings and decide exactly whether we want to require people to say custom, or if we're going to say custom is the default and you don't ever explicitly specify it.
Yeah, I mean, if it were for me, I would say I would be careful of implementing things like that in a generator, because I think people still reason about these things as if they were runtime state, and given that this thing is not nullable, it ought to have a value, right? We can decide what that value is, but not specifying it's just not logically sound, at least from my point of view.
Okay.
If that makes sense. But I mean, I would agree with you. Setting it explicitly to custom and then assigning a property, we could decide, look, this is just redundant, so don't do that. But that would be I don't know, not initializing a variable to 0, right? Or something like that. It doesn't seem like a bad thing that we should block.
I mean, I think we have analyzers now that tell you, hey, you redundantly initialize this variable to 0. But
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So,
but those are just those are IDE suggestions.
Yeah.
Those aren't strict enforcement.
2 other suggestions from the chat is, one is use string marshalling kind for the enum, but string marshalling for the property name. And then the other is instead of string marshalling for the type, it should be string marshaller for the type. But that feels wrong to me because it's an enum that's being used as a selector and not an actual marshaller. So, thoughts on either of those? Or do we just say we're tired of talking and ship it?
I like the current shape.
I think the current shape is good. I like where we landed.
All right, the Jeremys agree. So, it must be good. No, I don't need to copy it. It's
you gotta have all 3 of us in here then more often.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
Jeremys?
Is there a special name for a grouping of Jeremys? Like a group of owls is called a parliament.
I think we're a cacophony.
I think a group of Jeremys is called expensive.
All right. We renamed 2 things. We also had some discussions about other things, but I don't feel like writing that down. And we're good. Yes?
Yeah.
Sold. Presumably that thing they promised. That thing they promised. Issue 46838.
Yeah. So this API proposal includes 2 new attributes, which both combined with the struct marshalling design proposal. That was the struct marshalling design in the design docs for the DL import source generator will allow people to write their own custom marshallers. In addition, the string marshalling type property, what type you assign to that has to conform to the same model. We would have an analyzer that would enforce the design, and then these attributes are the use case for the design. The native marshalling attribute you would apply onto a struct or a class to say this is the default marshalling for the type, so that you don't have to explicitly specify any marshalling at the use site. And then the marshal using attribute allows you to override the marshalling at a use site, and also provide collection size information. And then I believe there is a third attribute that says that the marshaller is a collection marshaller because that has a slightly different shape than a non-collection marshaller. I'll send a link for the design doc if you want to bring that up for the stream.
So for native marshalling, that goes on a type that's providing marshalling, or you put it on the struct that needs no marshalling because it's already blittable?
You put native marshalling on a struct or class that needs marshalling, and the parameter you pass to it is the native type or the marshaller type.
Okay, so we wouldn't need to go and put it on like all the blittable types that are already correct.
No. The current model we've decided to use is we are using the disable runtime marshalling attribute to allow us to say unmanaged is blittable. So we no longer have an explicit mechanism. We no longer require an explicit mechanism for saying a type is blittable.
And in the case where you don't specify that, but the type doesn't use bool or char, will that still be implicitly blittable?
Yeah, if you're using bool or char, it will be implicitly blittable.
No. I mean, if you don't use the disable runtime marshalling attribute, so you don't specify it, but you have a type that, for example, only wraps int, and is therefore already blittable. It doesn't require changes. You don't need that. Will do the right thing as well, correct?
Yeah. The DLL import source generator, or the native import source generator, given the rename of the attribute, will require you to specify disable runtime marshalling.
Okay, it will require
you to side because it's at the native import declaration side is where disable runtime marshalling would affect.
Okay.
And I've sent the 2 design docs for the specifics of the shape. Yes. The shape of the marshallers is being enforced via an analyzer, as we cannot implement interfaces on ref structs, and many of these implementing marshaller types will contain span fields. So we can't enforce it with interfaces. So instead we have an analyzer that enforces the right shape.
If we end up getting support in a future version of the language for ref structs to implement interfaces in a limited fashion, is this going to be compatible with that? Is it worth talking with Jared to make sure that it would be, or to just go ahead and say we never care about that?
We could provide some interfaces that people could then implement to help enforce the size or help enforce the shape. The one case that would still be covered exclusively by the analyzer would be the constructor model, where the construction of the marshaller type or the native type is done by passing in the managed instance to a constructor of the native instance instead of using a static method.
And why do we want that instead of a static method? Just wanting clarity, not questioning the design here.
The idea was better ergonomics, where it makes sense if you're constructing an object, use a constructor. At the time when we designed this, there was no plan to do interfaces on ref structs. If we decide that that is a very important route to go down to help enforce the shape and make it a little bit more discoverable, then we could switch to like a create static method if we so desire.
Right. I was mainly asking because with static abstracts and interfaces, there is now the ability to do something like interface iCreatable static T create, and therefore you can enforce. You can basically enforce a constructor, but it can't actually be a constructor. Just an interesting thing with how it could evolve in the future, depending on when and if the language gets interface support for ref structs and some of the features that are coming in C#11.
Yeah, if that feature comes, then it might be worth revisiting the design of saying, instead of using a constructor, using a static method. That might be interesting. Other than that, I don't know.
Makes sense to me. It was just wanting to ask for clarity and to make sure that see if it was considered at all.
So one question I have is like, why do we have two different attributes to refer to a custom marshaller?
So the idea was native marshalling points to the default. Marshal using is for location specific overrides. I'd be fine switching to marshal using for everything. And then saying if you use any of the count information on marshal using, that's not valid for the default case, for like the default marshalling case, because that doesn't make sense.
I mean, I probably would prefer that in terms of concept count, but I think it depends on where you're going. I mean, another way to solve the problem is you could have like two attributes, again, where one is kind of indicating that it's a more specialized one or the other.
Yeah, we could say instead of native marshalling, it could be default marshal using or marshal using default.
Yeah, or like just call the other one native marshalling override or something, where you say, okay, in this case, I want something else.
Yeah, we could change that one as well.
But yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on where you're going. Like, what would be unfortunate? I mean, sometimes it's better to have one type. Sometimes it's worse, right? If you end up with like one type, but then the type has like kind of four different, completely distinctively separate usages, and then you have to kind of know, oh, these properties are valid in this scenario, these properties are valid in the other scenario, but we kind of chorus them into the same representation, that would be bad. But if it's just, well, you know, certain things just don't make sense in all cases, I think that's might be okay to say, yeah, we leave that to the analyzer to tell you when you're doing it wrong. Like, I guess it also depends on how often you actually set the properties, but I think it would be kind of nice if the vast majority of people would just end up using, you know, the type one, saying, okay, you know, you apply the type one when you want to do an override, or you don't have to if you only want to mess with the element types.
Yeah, most of the properties are specific. Most of the additional properties on marshal using are focused very much around the collection support.
Yeah.
So like providing size information and providing support for overriding marshalling for elements of a collection or elements of a collections of collections and so on.
And there's no way to do this at the field level, correct? It's only at the type and parameter level.
Marshal using, I do have marked to support the field level, but we don't currently have a source generator for structs for generating marshalling. So that would be a no op until we add that. So we could drop the attribute targets field for now and then add that back later. I do not believe that is a breaking change.
What for the collection support there? What is the consideration around so today the built-in marshaller and marshalling support supports the concept of I have a parameter that is the array and I have another parameter that is the count effectively. The thing that it doesn't support is when you have a field that is the size and you have another field that is the count. Is that something that's planning on being extended to as well,
Yes.
potentially in the future?
Yes, that's why instead of it being size param, the field that has that concept is count element name. And it will have the name, and you assign it the name of the field or the parameter or the provided returns count value.
Okay.
Constant, which it then uses to refer to the return value.
Question on the sample there. You have get long bytes as double. Is that long as in C long or long as in int64?
This is int64. This is just an example of usage.
Okay.
We're not actually proposing a double to long marshaller. This was just a simple example to show the full model, including a marshaller type and a value property, instead of just having a native type.
Right.
It's two-stage.
I'd gotten that. I was just asking for clarity in reading the sample, whether it was int64 or C long.
Okay. Yeah, it's int64.
Okay.
Because the other side of that, where that example is pulled from, that's pulled from the source generator tests. So both sides are actually C#, and we use D and NE in the middle.
Okay. Is the source generator generating a thing called long? Like is the source generator generating a name behind the scenes that includes long here?
No, it doesn't generate anything about like the native entry point or anything.
Okay.
So this is the count.
The count element name example. Yeah.
I guess looking at this, I have no idea what it does.
I understand what it does.
Yeah. If you guys have better names for any of the collection stuff, I am open to suggestions. So what this does is when marshalling out, you have the int pointer, and then that says how large is the collection? It's outside. It's whatever outside's value was coming out.
Right. So it uses the generated marshaller. Because of this, it says outsize, tells you how big to make the array, and then the pointer that it gets, it copies that much into the array.
Yes.
But then marshal with constant element count 10.
Well, it's always going to be 10.
So that the method also returns an array, just for putting out the example in one piece sake. And that basically says the array is always going to be 10 elements.
Okay, so this is the return value of the array. The thing you're calling into has a uint 8t star return and uint 8t star star here or something.
Yeah.
And that's the how to turn those things back into an array instead of wrapping it as the pointer types and doing the work yourself.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know that anyone will ever figure this out, but if someone explains it to you, it makes sense. So
it makes sense if you're familiar with SAL annotations as well, or Clang has some similar attribute annotations you can use.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the marshal as attribute has a size const and a size param index field. So people moving from DLL import to native import.
But the other way of you have a span and you need to call something that takes a pointer and a count. This does not know how to break the span apart to do the call for you. You'd still have to do that at the call site.
Yes, we do not introduce new parameters
Okay.
to allow you to pass the count down. That might be something we could add in the future, but that is not something we support today.
Right. When I heard the description, I was on the opposite direction, and so I was like, how in the world are you injecting a parameter? And the answer is you're not. So.
Yeah.
For so this covers when you have an element count. What about the case where you have a struct pointer, but it's a variable length struct, and therefore the sal annotation is number of bytes read instead of number of elements read? In which case the signature would be you're taking and returning potentially not a byte array, but rather an array of some struct, but it's not an element count that's being used for the parameter.
I don't think this supports that, and I don't think we had support for that with marshal as.
Yeah, we didn't. I was just more asking on if that was a consideration in the names or future expansions possible here.
That is not something we've thought about, to be entirely honest. Everything's been focused around element size. Mm-hmm. And if you need to marshal construct weirdly because it's variable length, the answer is still get back a pointer or ref to it and then work from there.
Yeah, because you'd have to teach it how the struct internally identifies how much data got copied at the end of it.
Yeah. A big part of the collection design is the collection marshalling. For basically, it provides a mechanism for you to specify how do I marshal a collection, and then it lets you do how do I marshal the elements as a separate concept. So basically, you can say for an array, I have X number, I have X number of elements. The native size is going to be Y, so I need to create X times Y amount of space to pass down to native.
So the best thing for the user in that case would be to basically lie and take a byte array instead and use the element count as bytes and effectively do reinterpreting or custom marshalling themselves potentially.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
If they're okay with the double copy.
Or doing everything with birefs.
Yeah. Or pointers, because why not? Ignore Levi crying.
I was thinking of Barry, but...
Well, it used to be Morgan who did all the crying with pointers, but he left us, so now it's Levi's job. I refuse to cry.
I'm fine with pointers. You use pointers. If it makes code easy to understand, do it.
Yeah, and then okay. Personally, I don't understand this very long worded thing. Generic contiguous collection marshaller.
As per everything else in this proposal, give me better names. I am bad at naming things. The idea with this is this is when we added the collection support. We added support for marshalling contiguous collections. So we don't have support for marshalling from a managed collection to something that stores elements non-contiguously, like a native linked list. We support marshalling to array style things from things that are more array style or span style, where the managed values can be represented as a span and the native values can be represented as a span of bytes. So that was the idea of the name. And it's also where we added support for generics. So you could have, on list of T, you can say, my native marshaller is list marshaller. And no matter what T it is for list, it'll substitute it in and then require there to be marshalling rules for that T.
So what is the contract for the thing that you mark with that attribute? It has to basically have the shape you listed here, but you basically have to take a span in.
Yeah, so it's basically you have to have a constructor that has one parameter that takes the size of the native element. If you want to support, so for manage to native, native to manage, they're separate options, but you can do them all at once. So there's the taking in the size of the native element, there's taking in the managed value and the size of the native element. There's a managed values property that provides a span over the managed values. There is a span that provides the native value storage. There's a method set unmarshaled collection length, which that gets passed in the element count. So maybe we can unify those names. The get pinnable reference is optional. That's if you need something pinned. And then the value property gets you the underlying byte to pass to the pointer to pass to native. And then free native frees anything that you allocated.
Is there a concern here? So this is obviously going to be under runtime interop services, and we explicitly put collections marshal in the same because getting a span to the managed list is potentially dangerous. Are there concerns about exposing the managed values here? Or likewise,
so we're not
likewise how users are going to potentially use the or potentially fall into a pit of failure with getting the backing span.
So we're not planning on exposing list marshaller. This was just an example.
Okay.
Yeah, this doc has a lot of examples of things because a lot of it is shape based, and we aren't using the interfaces contract because of the whole ref structs problem.
Yeah, so my question earlier was kind of like if span is kind of an intrinsic part of your interface, maybe just call it span-based marshaller.
Okay.
Like if you have, like, that's kind of why I asked the contract, because I wasn't sure whether the contract that's sketched here is the only contract or whether there's like, oh, you can either do this or that and then this will work.
So this has all of the options barring one additional optimization option. But the base contract for the collections is the size of native element parameters, the set unmarshaled collection length, and the managed and native value storage.
And if you go to the bottom of the description, there's the shape of it with things marked optional or required.
Yeah.
With the native value storage, that's not a reinterpret cast of managed values. That's some second location in memory.
Yes.
Okay.
That is basically because the idea of the collection marshallers is, per the design, you do not need to know what the element type is. The collection marshaller is told, this is the managed element type, this is the size of the native element. You do not need to know how to marshal between those two. The source generated marshalling will handle plugging all of the marshallers together.
Okay. What's the stack buffer size const?
That is so stack buffer size, this is also included on the non-generic model, which is earlier in this code snippet. Stack buffer size is used for saying oh, Eleanor, did we update this with the new design?
Because it says it's if you use the constructor that takes a span of byte. So is it that the caller will stack alloc this much and then pass the buffer there?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we updated the one above, but we might have missed this one.
Yeah.
So the one above, I think, is just buffer size.
Yeah, and then yes, it's this one.
Buffer size requires stack
and then
buffer.
requires stack buffer. That's the design that we want to use for the bottom one as well. We just forgot to update it. And basically, the caller will allocate the span of byte, pass it down to the marshaller, and then the marshaller can use that stack space if it is more efficient to marshal into that stack space than it is to allocate its own memory. For example, like smaller strings, smaller arrays, stuff like that.
Okay, and then stuff. I don't think there's any reason that we can't have a pointer property, but I don't know that we ever have had one before.
So, yeah, basically you're not required to make it a pointer, but it's the native value being passed down, so you might as well be specific.
Fair enough.
It just needs to be, the value property just needs to return a type that does not require any additional marshalling. So it can be a blittable struct, it can be a primitive, it can be a primitive value type, it can be a pointer, it can be a function pointer, it can be an int or a nuint. It just has to be something that doesn't require any additional work.
Fair enough. So it's a placeholder, but we can't use the generic syntax here because then we would think it was actually generic, and this is a shape.
Yes.
Instead of a. Fair enough.
Out of curiosity, are you proposing a code fixture that once you apply the attribute can actually generate the stubs at least? Because I mean, normally with interfaces you can just put the interface and then control dot, because you have a pretty large surface area you expect people to have.
Yeah, I would be fine adding the code fix. We just don't currently have one.
Yeah, because it's going to be annoying when you write the type and then you get like 20 error messages that says like, oh, you need to add these fairly long-winded declarations.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I like the idea of interfaces. It just wasn't tenable, because like every single example that wants to support allocating into a color allocated buffer has to store that span as a field, which makes it a ref struct, which means you can't do interfaces.
All right, so presumably we should look at these shapes and talk about the names on the shapes, because that's going to define how people have to write code in the future.
Yes.
And then we also have the attributes themselves. So.
Yeah, I mean, Levi asked a question in chat that I thought was interesting. Like, are you requiring unsafe code for the generator to work?
Yes, the generator will. I believe the generator always requires unsafe code, or in like 99% of cases, you'll end up needing unsafe code anyway. Like for splittable types, you don't need it, but the moment you use strings, you need it, because you need to be able to pin strings for most cases.
Are you going to check for that and fail, or are you just generating the code and let the compiler handle that?
I believe we're just letting the compiler handle it at the moment, but we could.
Yeah, my only concern with that is because basically you spit out a bunch of code that doesn't compile. I'm not sure that the user sees this as I misconfigured my project, versus, it seems the generator has a bug.
Yeah, it'll say the unsafe switch is not being passed.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair. It might be obvious, but in general, like, I think if we should just have a single error message rather than 1,000, right? Depending on how much code you generate.
Yeah.
So or just or just allow unsafe blocks true by default.
Well, now you need to talk to a completely different team.
Yeah.
I think your experience of who needs unsafe might be slightly biased.
But yeah, the takeaway from there is just to make sure that the experience is good for people.
All right. So on the shape, certainly Marshaller doesn't care what the parameter of managed type is named, right? It's just
no. It just needs to be a single parameter.
There is
and whatever that managed type is, things that are of that type can say I use this as a marshaller.
And it needs to match whatever toManaged says.
Yes. If there is a toManaged method, then it needs to match toManaged.
Oh, because it could be a unidirectional.
Yeah.
Marshaller. Okay, so parameter names in the shape aren't interesting, but the const and method and property names are, because those are things you have to write. Get pinnable reference is the standard. To managed seems... To managed is fine. To managed value might be better. I don't know. Does anybody have opinions on this thing? I can read all the words, but I'd like to go to lunch at some point today.
It makes sense to me. I mean, my only concern is that it's, unless we have us doing some work, it's hard to document what our expectations for a shape is, right? That's the unfortunate thing. Because normally we use, interfaces or abstract classes to tell people what an expectation is, and now it's basically just between you and the generator. But I mean, we have done this in other places, but usually it's like one member, right? This is the first time we have like, you have to have this very magic shape that we check for.
So I'm actually surprised Tanner didn't say this, but int for sizes rather than just new int, just to convince everyone to do the right thing from the get-go.
We'd have to cast it down to int anyway to get a span of bytes.
This is where I should finish the proposal for update, either exposing native span or updating span to support inuint.
Yeah.
Yeah, like clearly the size of each element is never going to be bigger than assigned int 32. But I'm just wondering if, since we are talking about interop, and there is a drive to just kind of do the right thing and use all the right types going forward, I'm just wondering if we should just, since this is a fresh API, just do it right.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have it be correct. That way, even if we don't get to quote unquote fixing span for .NET 7, if we decide to fix it in the future or expose some other way to do it, then we don't have to also consider updating all of the...
Well, but we would, because if we go with span and bigger span, then you would now need to add the bigger span overload to accept the stack buffer or to accept an external buffer that required a bigger span.
Right,
And
you'd have to expose...
stuck on the properties for managed values and native value storage.
Right.
Right, it's just a question of, do you have something that effectively starts with doing a checked conversion to make sure that it fits within the span length, and then potentially have two sets of properties for counts and everything like that, or do you just expose the one correctly sized count, and then you only have to worry about a second constructor that takes in the other type if we expose two types?
Can you put an int or an nuint in an attribute property?
Provided that the actual constant is fits into an int 32, then yes.
Okay.
The runtime supports inint and inuit constants, provided that they're 32 bits, and therefore can be sign or zero extended up to the correct size in the case it's a 64-bit platform.
That's probably reasonable for constant element count then. Yeah, so maybe set unmarshaled collection length, rename that to set element count, so that we're consistent with Marshall using.
Are we talking about the shape, or are we talking about the proposal? Or the attribute?
Name a member on the shape to match the names on the Marshall using attribute API proposal would be one thing that we might be worth doing. Also adding an attribute to go on the non-collection marshaller shape, so that the analyzer knows to look at that type and analyze it as a marshaller instead of what we currently do. The current way that we determine what to look at to determine if it's a marshaller is we look at Marshall using and native marshalling attribute usages, and then look at the type specified in them, and then validate that that type is shaped correctly.
Okay.
have another slightly related question. Like, how do you plan on versioning this?
Shapely.
So let's say in the next version you say like, well, you can either have this shape or that shape. How do you expect people to deal with that?
Well, so for the collection extension, what we did is we introduced an attribute that said we're this, like, look for this shape instead of the other shape.
I guess that's fair. Yeah, if you have a completely disjoint thing, you would just introduce a different attribute. And for everything else, you could make it incrementally. You could say, well, if you have that property, then we do this extra thing, and if you don't, then we don't.
Yeah, for example, like require stack buffer, we decided using bool constants was one way to go also. So if it's just like flipping little options where the same shape works, but you're trying to say do this thing versus do that thing.
Yeah, I think for those kind of things, it kind of sucks. I think if you want to do that, I probably would suggest, instead of having these constants, make them properties on the attribute.
Okay.
Because otherwise, how would people even discover that they have those choices, right? I mean, sure, you can say it's in the document section somewhere, but people generally don't look there.
Yeah.
Well, but if the requires stack buffer is a behavior of the marshaller, since the attribute just says the type of the marshaller to use, that doesn't seem like it would be appropriate on the attribute.
Yeah, we could include an attribute that would go on the marshaller, and instead of having the generic collection, the generic contiguous collection marshaller attribute, we have like some sort of like native marshaller attribute, and then on that attribute, you can provide the options of caller allocated buffer size, requires stack buffer. And then the other one would be like we have like which basically an enum that would be like which shape is this supposed to be? Is this supposed to be a value marshaller? Is this supposed to be a collection marshaller?
Collection marshaller v4. Oh.
Yeah, if you put it like this, there seems to be lots of moving pieces to my suggestion, which is unfortunate, but I just wanted to raise the concern. I don't have necessarily a great solution to this, but I would generally say configuration should probably be on a type where you can discover it rather than driven off of just shape conventions, because I feel like that might eventually be messy.
Yeah.
But a middle ground might be we start with this and then we adjust from there based on the experiences we make with that.
Yeah, we can take this for another round. We can try out the idea of moving some stuff to attributes and trying to clean up some of the naming.
Yeah, I will say I really like the struct-based thing here because it's clearly, as little overhead as possible, but it does make me uneasy that there's no obvious way to discover the shapes or the configuration settings from that.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I was thinking I like the idea of static abstracts on it, like static abstract members from interfaces and stuff like that. But we're kind of stuck at that point, and I don't want to tie this feature to that getting into the language.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should tie to it, but static abstracts are supposed to ship in .NET 7, and if not, then I'm doing a lot of work on generic math for little benefit right now. But
well, it's not static abstracts that's the problem.
It's ref structs.
It's ref structs and interfaces. That's the issue.
But it might be worth syncing with Jared, at least to determine where in the pipeline that is and how likely it is within the next X versions of .NET, and not blocking on this, but at least taking into consideration if it's likely to come for .NET 7, then tentatively prepping the API surface proposal for that, so that way it could rapidly go in if it does come through. And if not, then at least keeping in mind within the next, maybe one version or two versions that it could come, and so we should potentially be extensible to that. Just like a kind of a buffer, so that if it does come, we are able to do the better thing. And if it doesn't come, then we're no worse off than what the proposal covers today.
Yeah. So basically, yeah. So the question for there would be, do we want to keep the constructor model for creating the marshaller or the native type, or do we want to switch to a static create method? And I know that JIT is sometimes kind of weird with constructors, so I don't know if one would optimize better than the other.
I imagine that most implementations for that format would end up being, worst case, a create method that forwards to the actual constructor.
Okay, so yeah, we could. Yeah, we could. I think we could start with the constructor model and then evolve if we're able to switch to an interface model.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we're definitely running late, and I have to go very soon. So of things on the attribute, right? Like count element name is probably better as element count parameter name.
Yeah. I don't like putting parameter in there because I want this to be usable when we add struct marshalling that includes fields, because we want to use the same thing, but I don't have a good term for parameter or field or return value.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. So
element and direction level, I would love to get some feedback on because I don't have a good name for that.
So I have one
pretty
more
sure the answer is
question.
12, but go ahead.
As it stands right now, there's no attribute that would be applied to the generator itself, right? You would only have an attribute on the thing that, sorry, not generator, to the marshaller itself, right? It's only for the other thing that says I want to use the marshaller, right?
Yeah, except for the one saying use the collection shape. But I'm thinking based on this feedback, we can take the one that says use the collection shape and change that to be this is a marshaller, and then here is data X. Like here are the different configuration things that you need that need to be constant anyway for the generator to use. So put them in an attribute where they already need to be constant.
Yeah, if we want to have a code fixer, I think on the type that would emit the shape anyways, I think you want something that is on the type that says this is a marshaller, right? Otherwise, how would you wire this up, right? You don't want
to wire it up from the place that says.
Yeah, which is
this is like make like this
great.
Type is my marshaller, then go generate a shape for me to be the marshaller for that.
Right.
Okay, so it sounds like the main actionable thing is try moving some of the usage information out of the shape and into a marshaller attribute, and then see what falls out of that.
Yes.
Okay.
And then also the names, right?
Yeah, and align some of the names better and just give it another shot.
I mean, this is a great feature. Like, I hope you don't leave the impression that we pooped all over it, because I think it's a great way to use generators. It's just that our experience, I think, with defining the interface between the developer and the generators is still something we learn, right? And so there's some uncertainty on what we think is acceptable and what isn't.
Yeah, I think we're getting there for tools in the toolbox to do it. Static abstracts definitely helps. Even if you're not going to use them as static abstracts throughout the generics, being able to specify the shape is great.
Yeah. And is there a reason why we can't have ref structs with virtuals? Is this a fundamental limitation, or did we just cut a corner to not complicate the engine?
You can't do ref structs with interfaces because you might be able to box it that way. And then it would go on. So there needs to be something that says this is a ref struct, you can't box it, but it can still implement the interface or whatever the language design team decides to do. And there's no way to say this interface exclusively provides static abstracts and don't let anything box into it.
Static interface.
Yes, static interface would solve a lot of problems. Basically saying, this is my contract. I don't care what you do with it. Just you can't cast anything to me.
I'm just passed as a generic for duck typing. Or I guess it's better than duck typing because it's an interface. Okay, so I think those are the two main follow-up points, and then individual names and stuff we'll have to hammer out at a different time.
Sounds good.
Is there anything else I forgot to write down that anybody remembers? Okay, if you remember late, you can just add a comment to the issue. Since there is a follow-up of see if you can move the shape into an attribute, which will introduce a new attribute, I'm going to go ahead and call it needs work, just so the tool has something to talk about when I push the send email button.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We are so out of time that we aborted talking about an issue. And it's good that we aborted because that means I do have time for lunch before my next appointment. So, see you all next week, where we still will have a whole lot of issues to talk about. I'll leave it up to Emo to decide when we need to start going back to twice a week. I declare this meeting adjourned.
There's no over and out.
That's apparently next time I host, when apparently I need to re-embrace my trucker roots. So
You need to. All right.